Well, the U.S. aviation regulator says it's launching a new review of the safety of the Boeing 737 MAX. The Federal Aviation Administration in the States says the review is expected to look at the certification process of the aircraft. Boeing faces multiple lawsuits over the crash of the Ethiopian Airlines flight last month. John Hendren is live for us in Chicago, where Boeing is based. So, John, this all increases the pressure on the company.
It does indeed. There were three key findings from those Ethiopian transportation officials, all of them bad news for Boeing. The first was that the pilots followed all of the procedures that Boeing provided in order to try to correct the trajectory of that plane. So that suggests, according to those preliminary findings, that there was no pilot error. They also found there was no damaged sensor. Why was that important? Because if there was a damaged sensor, that could be a maintenance problem. Therefore, the airlines could be blamed for that problem. So that really centers the focus of the investigation on that software system. And interestingly, Boeing was self-certified for much of that plane, much of the revamp of that plane that turned the 737 into the 737 MAX 8. So they did a lot of the certification on behalf of the FAA. It's a common procedure. Interestingly, they also sold a software fix as an option for about $80,000. Now, if that is deemed to have been responsible for the accident, the lack of that fix, which neither of those two crashed planes had, that could be a serious problem for Boeing and even lead to criminal culpability. We don't know because these are merely preliminary findings, but it is that software system that all of the attention is now focused on.
And are we now in the territory of lawsuits, John?
That's right. I'm standing outside of a lawyer's office here in Chicago right now. Within the hour, we are about to hear about the latest lawsuit. In this case, it is the family of a young woman who died in that most recent crash, suing both Boeing and the manufacturer of one of the parts that could be responsible for the crash. Now, interestingly, this woman is the niece of Ralph Nader, a one-time presidential candidate. Also, more importantly, in this case, he's a consumer advocate who has taken on auto companies for flawed parts in the past. So he is a formidable nemesis to have. He will be here merely on the telephone, but the mother of the victim will be here, and she was upstairs, emotional, crying just a short while ago. This is before the press conference, so we were expecting this to be an emotional day here and another lawsuit that could be yet further devastating news for Boeing.
John, thanks very much. Talk to you later. Well, let's stay with that story. Kyle Bailey is an aviation analyst and formerly an FAA safety representative. He joins us here on the NewsHour from Skype, on Skype from New York. Kyle Bailey, welcome to Al Jazeera. So what's your reading of this interim report?
You know, the interim report is very, very vague, and it's pretty much telling us stuff that we already knew, stuff that has been leaked out the last couple days. We know that the pilots fought for control of the airplane and that the MCAS system was engaged and disengaged several times, though they're not getting into the exact number. One interesting thing I want to point out is that, you know, we hear about the pilots struggling for control, and that when they, you know, perhaps maneuvered the controls of the aircraft, that the plane wasn't responding. It's to my understanding that when the MCAS system is engaged, that the control yoke on the airplane, that's typically, you know, in an average man's terms, the control to lower or raise the nose of the plane that sits in front of the pilot, that pretty much that will not override the MCAS system. So that's an interesting point there, that perhaps he might not have been aware of that control would not override the system. But it's right now, you know, we just have to wait for the black box data to be released in full. Everything right now seems to be pretty much on the vague side.
Is a tech patch or an upgrade to the software enough, or does the aircraft need to be radically redesigned? One remembers, I think it was a British Airways 747. It was known within the aviation world as the glider because they lost all four engines. And any aircraft, if it's built properly, it will literally glide down to land. That's what an aeroplane, literally the word aeroplane, is supposed to do. But if you've got a 737 MAX, if they lose everything for some reason and it naturally tilts down and goes into a dive, or tilts up and goes into a stall, does that mean it's inherently flawed?
Well, the interesting thing about the MAX 8 is this is the first in the 737 series or the engine placement has actually been moved. So what we have is that affects the weight and balance, the center of gravity on the airplane. So if they're tweaking the MCAS software, in other words, how it will recover to a situation, whenever you have any engineering changes into a complex system, there could be other results that perhaps they might not be aware of. That's why it's so essential that this has to be, their fix has to be tested and retested, and it has to be 100%. And I think with the scrutiny, the whole world is looking at this now. I think both Boeing, the FAA, and all the governments who have these airplanes who are involved in the investigation, they're going to make sure that everything is 100% before this aircraft is allowed to operate in the respective countries.
When you talk about the aircraft operating in respective countries, I mean, we're talking about, what, 370 aircraft sold to 47 different carriers. I mean, a subtle, delicate estimate has been $5 billion worth out of a profit margin of $100 billion. That's how much Boeing made, according to the most recent statistics. But the impact of that on Boeing could perhaps be even bigger.
Yes, it could. And keep in mind, Boeing is not just in the aerospace. They are in defense. But obviously, their bread and butter is the airplane business. But they're very good at what they do. Boeing has, hundreds, if not thousands, of engineers on staff. They know the game. This isn't the first time where they've had to overcome, technical issues, not necessarily as a result of a crash, but, these engineers and the staff that they have working there are the best of the best. And, I think when they go through the process, and even with the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, Boeing is not going to let this airplane fly unsafe. And we have to remember, too, Boeing knows that it cannot have another one of these instances. So they're going to make sure that this airplane is 100% before they allow it to get back into skies with passengers.
Clearly, Kyle, upgrades are not an admission of guilt. So that's not how I'm framing my next question. You and your family go to JFK first thing tomorrow morning. The airline that you've bought your tickets from says to you, we've got the upgrade, the plane is safe. Do you put you and your family on a 737 MAX?
Here in the U.S., I know how diligent and how fantastic the Federal Aviation Administration here is here in the United States. And I know how good Boeing is. So if I were to get on an airplane or if I'm deciding, and I know that they have the green light from both Boeing and the FAA, I would not hesitate to get on the airplane after the fix is put into effect and after the pilots are trained on what the fix is. I would not hesitate to get on the airplane.
Kyle Bailey, good to talk to you. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.